In William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, Caesar mocks the soothsayer's earlier prediction to beware the Ides of March. Later, Caesar says the Ides of March have come to point out the supposed dreaded day did not bring disaster. The soothsayer responds with a prophetic point, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." Shortly thereafter, Caesar is stabbed many times over by conspirators in the Senate, including by his good friend Marcus Brutus. As he lies dying, Caesar mumbles those infamous last words, "Et tu, Brute?" Then falls Caesar. What often gets lost in popular history is that this is just a play, not an actual accurate portrayal of the assassination of Julius Caesar. Like any modern-day movie, this was Shakespeare taking considerable literary and creative license with a real event. Caesar's last dying breath was not "Et tu, Brute," as even some before Shakespeare had claimed. However, it is accurate that Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March, which is March the 15th on today's calendar. So, what really happened on this day? Rome in 44 BCE was a city bubbling over with tension. Several years earlier, civil war had begun when Pompey-led factions of the Senate asked Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Why did this spark a war? By the Cornelia Majestatis law, governors of Roman provinces, pro-magistrates, were not allowed to bring any part of their army within Italy itself, and if they tried, they automatically forfeited their right to rule even in their own province. The only ones who were allowed to command soldiers in Italy were consuls or praetors. Caesar knew to return without his army at his back, which was what was required given the political climate at the time, would be exceptionally risky. And so he had to decide whether the risk was greater to bring his army or to go alone. As then Roman aristocrat Marcus Caelius Rufus aptly summed up, "The closer we come to this inevitable clash, the more apparent the danger. At the heart of the issue is this. Pompey declares he won't allow Caesar to be elected consul unless Caesar relinquishes control over his army and provinces. Caesar, on the other hand, is convinced his status is threatened if he gives up his troops. So now their scandalous liaison isn't stepping behind the scenes, but exploding into full-scale war." It should be noted here that shortly before this, Caesar did make an offer to the Senate that he would disband his army on the condition that Pompey do the same. The Senate even voted on the issue, with 370 votes for accepting Caesar's terms and 22 against. Ultimately, however, Pompey and some of the 22 went against this vote, and he refused to go along with the plan. Not long after, the Senate declared Caesar a public enemy. Negotiations nonetheless continued, with Caesar again making the same offer, but it was rejected. Later he offered that they'd let him keep one legion and allow him to govern Illyria, which is the Balkans today. He would disband the rest of his legions. That offer was likewise shot down, in large part due to speeches against it given by Cato the Younger. This all finally led to Caesar deciding the safer bet for himself was to march on Rome. Shortly before the news hit Rome that Caesar was coming with an army, many of the senators, along with the consuls G. Gladius Marcellus, L. Cornelius Lentulus Crus, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, aka Pompey, they fled. Rome was under the impression that Caesar was bringing nearly his whole highly experienced army to Rome, which would have massively outnumbered the forces they had there. They had not dreamed that he'd be so bold to strike with a lesser force. Instead, he was just bringing one legion, largely due to speed's sake and a bit of a gamble by Caesar. You see, while Pompey had 2 legions at his command, one of them, the 15th Legion, was formerly Caesar's and had been swindled out of his hands by the Senate and given to Pompey not long before. The Senate had requested the use of a legion, but then when the legion arrived and was put in Pompey's hands, they cancelled their plan to use it against the Parthians and simply put the legion under Pompey's direct control. Thus, Caesar thought this legion might just end up turning on Pompey and fighting for him instead. Although it's noteworthy that later Caesar was unable to turn them against Pompey when they did begin to meet in battle. At the same time Caesar was marching on Rome with the one legion, he'd also organized a couple of others to join him, and even more to move into strategic locations, close enough to join him if necessary, but also in positions to block support troops getting to Pompey. Had he actually waited to gather his forces at once, it would have given Pompey time to bring as many legions to Rome, as well as to raise more in the interim. A few years later, largely thanks to Pompey struggling to raise new forces of his own, thanks in part to Caesar's reputation for cruelty against those who opposed him on the battlefield and his ever-growing reputation as a commander, Caesar defeated Pompey, with the older one-time friend and teacher being executed by Egypt's king in 48 BCE. The victor returned to Rome and was declared dictator for 10 years. However, Caesar stocked the Senate with allies, and he was ultimately named dictator for life. Of course, this did not sit well with many Roman citizens, elites, or those who were not Caesar supporters in the Senate. While they had endured Sulla as dictator not long before, a dictator for life was a bit too close to king in the eyes of many. To put the gravity of this designation in perspective, kings ruled Rome prior to the founding of the Republic by Lucius Junius Brutus. Lucius Brutus, ancestor of the more famous Brutus of Et Brut fame in roughly 509 BC, summoned the Roman people to vote for the overthrow and exile of the monarchy, an act of rebellion sparked by the rape of a Roman noblewoman and Brutus's kin Lucretia by one Sextus Tarquinius, who in turn was the son of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, who just happened to also be the king of Rome. After the monarchy was successfully deposed, one of Brutus's first acts was supposedly to get the people to swear an oath that never again would a king rule in Rome. Unsurprising from this, in the years leading up to 44 BCE, as described in Barry Strauss's book The Death of Caesar, the story of history's most famous assassination, several other Caesar assassination plots were thwarted before they were carried out. Nonetheless, the dictator wasn't shaken despite the number of enemies that he was accumulating. He didn't help matters with his behavior though. For instance, in either December 45 BCE or January 44 BCE, the Senate voted on formally presenting honors to Caesar. As Caesar sat in front of the temple of Mother Venus, the Senate marched to him, expecting to be greeted. Despite etiquette calling for Caesar to stand, he did not, even making jokes about the senators and rejecting their gift. This, of course, did not sit well with the ruling class. However, it should be noted that according to Plutarch, Caesar would later blame his failure to rise and his behavior on his frequent sickness. Long claimed to have been seizures, but that may not actually be the case, as we'll get to shortly. This resulted in him becoming, to quote Plutarch, speedily shaken and whirled about, bringing on giddiness and insensibility. Another noteworthy incident took place shortly afterward when a crowd greeted Caesar as Rex, Latin for king, a major no-no in Roman politics as previously mentioned. On this one, according to Dio, two tribunes, Gaius Epidius Marulus and Lucius Acestius Flavus, had the person believed to have started the chant arrested. Caesar was supposedly furious for what he thought to be poor treatment of the person and ultimately saw to it that the two tribunes were stripped of their titles. Another incident occurred during the Lupercalia festival, in which fertility is celebrated. Mark Antony presented Caesar with a diadem, essentially a crown. While many in the crowd sat in stunned silence, Caesar refused it. Antony tried again, and this time Caesar said, "Jupiter alone of the Romans is king." This got a huge amount of applause from the crowd. Later, Caesar made sure it was recorded that he refused this crown. Whether this was a staged event to try and convince everyone that Caesar had no interest in being king, despite working hard at acquiring all the powers one normally associates with a king, or not, with more and more incidents of Caesar being compared to a king, the ruling class were restless. Many among them saw Caesar as a power-hungry tyrant who needed to be stopped before it was too late. While Shakespeare gives Brutus and Cassius the role as lead conspirators in the downfall of Caesar, it should also be noted that outside of Plutarch, who wrote his account almost a century and a half after Caesar's death, most other ancient sources list another as the key conspirator of the trio. This includes the earliest account, written by Nicholas of Damascus within a few decades of the event, naming Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who Shakespeare incorrectly called Decius, as the most important of the three in organizing Caesar's death. Decimus was a high-ranking general and close friend of Caesar, and was perhaps the man that Caesar trusted the most of the three, and the only one of the trio that supported Caesar throughout his war with Pompey. It isn't clear today why Decimus turned on his friend. Speculation abounds on this, with some believing that he was angry at having been passed over for a promotion, or that he felt he'd been disrespected, such as when Caesar broke tradition and allowed some of his other lieutenants to conduct triumphal parades. But he did not allow Decimus the same honor after Decimus's great victories in Gaul. Or it could just be that he was jealous of Caesar. Whatever the case, it was Decimus, a man who was one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, even through the previous war with Pompey, who made sure Caesar went to the Portico of Pompey that fateful day. As for Brutus, while Shakespeare depicts him as something of a son to Caesar, this is in fact a bit of misrepresentation. While Brutus was technically an ally of Caesar, this was only after being given a large amount of money and a posh political appointment to buy that allegiance. Directly before this, unlike Decimus, he had been Caesar's enemy, fighting alongside Pompey during the Civil War. On top of that, about a year before the assassination, Brutus divorced his wife and married his cousin Porcia, who was the daughter of Cato the Younger, a recently deceased enemy of Caesar's who had killed himself rather than live under Caesar's rule. That said, it should be noted that during the war, Caesar had specified that Brutus, if captured, should be brought in alive, unlike certain others. But why he did this isn't fully clear given Brutus's actions. It has been speculated that this may have been out of affection for Brutus's mother, who was formerly Caesar's mistress. Some have further speculated that Brutus was in fact the son of Caesar and that Caesar knew it, but this would have put Caesar fathering Brutus at the age of 15. Not impossible, of course, but most historians think unlikely, and there is no documented evidence to back this claim up. As for Cassius, he was a senator and likewise an opponent of Caesar's during the war with Pompey, as well as being known to chafe under Caesar's rule. So this brings us to the soothsayer in Shakespeare's play. There is no record of any individual saying the words, "Beware the Ides of March." It does appear, however, that Caesar was warned that his life was in danger for a 30-day period ending on March the 15th, not just in danger on the Ides of March. This warning came from a haruspex by the name of Spurina. This, however, was an easy prediction that was likely no news to Caesar given the political climate. Spurina's access to the elites of Rome also ensured that he was just as well acquainted with the rumors of the conspiracies against Caesar. Even the 30-day number was mostly a no-brainer. Everyone knew that Caesar was to embark Rome on March the 18th, which meant that an attempt on his life needed to be done before that day. Once Caesar was off campaigning, if he was successful in those campaigns, his popularity with the people would only grow, and surrounded by his army, there would be little chance to safely get rid of him directly for some time. And so it was that shortly before his death, Decimus convinced Caesar to change his mind on his plans to skip the Senate session on the 15th. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had been insisting that Caesar keep a low profile before his upcoming military campaign, and particularly that he avoid the Senate meetings where he'd be vulnerable as only senators were allowed inside and Caesar would be unarmed. As Nicholas of Damascus writes, his friends were alarmed at certain rumors and tried to stop him from going to the Senate House, as did his doctors, for he was suffering from one of his occasional dizzy spells. His wife, Calpurnia especially, who was frightened by some visions in her dreams, clung to him and said that she would not let him go out that day. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators who was then thought of as a firm friend, came up and said, "What is this, Caesar? Are you a man to pay attention to a woman's dreams and the idle gossip of stupid men, and to insult the Senate by not going out, although it has honored you and has been specially summoned by you? But listen to me. Cast aside the forebodings of all these people and come. The Senate has been in session, waiting for you since early this morning." Beyond Decimus goading him into going, it's also significant to note that Caesar may not at this point have been in his right mind. While it's traditionally stated, as previously noted, that Caesar suffered from the occasional seizure, this may not have actually been what was happening, despite Caesar himself claiming such. Caesar played up the morbus comitalis angle, owing to the fact that those who suffered from epilepsy were thought to be touched by the gods during their episode, with the condition called by Hippocrates the sacred disease because of it. However, researchers Dr. Francesco Galassi and Houghton Ashrafian posit that Caesar's actual symptoms, including dizziness, headaches, limb weakness, and sudden falls, seem more closely in line with suffering from transient ischemic attacks, also known as mini-strokes. Beyond the symptoms more lining up with this, it's also noted that rather than being a lifelong malady, his condition did not pop up until later in life, which would actually be a very rare thing for epilepsy. From this, it is speculated that the supposed episode that occurred shortly before the Senate Senate meetings may have seen Caesar not thinking as rationally as he otherwise might have. And indeed, given the rumors, and Caesar himself knowing any attempt on his life, if it came at all, would come around this time, it seems odd that he did choose to go that day. Whatever his state of mind, Caesar made his way to the Senate on the so-called Ides of March, essentially the divide or middle day of March, signifying the midpoint of the month, which was the 13th in most months at this time, excepting March, May, July, and October. Contrary to many depictions, he did not, however, go to the Senate House, as it was being renovated at the time, according to Plutarch, nor did he go to Capitoline Hill, as Shakespeare said. Rather, he went to the portico of Pompeii, where the conspirators were putting on gladiatorial games at the theatre and the Senate was convening. Here, once again, we see Decimus playing a key role in that he provided the gladiators, not just for the show, but so that they'd be nearby if the conspirators needed them for protection after the assassination. Soon after his arrival, several senators approached Caesar, seeming to discuss important matters with him. They formed a perimeter around Caesar, not just to get close to attack him from all sides, but also to make sure that no senators who supported Caesar could come to his end before he'd been dealt a fatal blow. Outside, Mark Antony was being distracted by Gaius Trebonius. A seasoned soldier and a strong supporter of Caesar, Antony could have potentially foiled the plan, or at least made it much more risky for the conspirators if the two great soldiers fought back to back. This perhaps would have allowed some of the other former soldiers turned senators that Caesar had strategically put in place the time needed to come to his aid before the deed was done. And indeed, we know that at least two of the senators, Gaius Calvisius Sabinus and Lucius Marcius Censoronius, attempted to aid Caesar, but could not get to him fast enough. Inside their togas, the conspirators had hidden daggers. Caesar reportedly seemed suspicious of their approach, but an old friend, Tullius Cimber, came up to him with a petition. Upon reaching Caesar, he grabbed Caesar's toga, causing Caesar to exclaim, "Ista quidem vis est?" Why this violence? Caesar very quickly got his answer as daggers were produced and he began to be stabbed. That said, unlike Shakespeare's play, Caesar, a great fighter himself, fought back, including severely injuring at least one participant, Casca, with a stylus. Caesar also tried to escape, but tripped and fell, where he was an easy target on the ground. But he did not die in the arms of Brutus, and he did not say "et Brute" as far as any historical account notes. Historians agree that Brutus was there and did stab Caesar, but there is no indication that he was the last person to do so, or that Caesar placed any special significance on Brutus being one of the attackers. As for what Caesar actually said as he lay there dying, most historical accounts seem to indicate that it was nothing at all, or at least that nothing was recorded. Once the deed was done and death was near, he simply covered his face with his toga, speculated to have been an act to preserve his dignity as he lay dying, ironically enough, near a statue of Pompeii. After Caesar's assassination, there was initial hope that Rome would once again become a republic. Instead, it fell back into the hands of an all-encompassing leader in less than 2 decades. That was Emperor Octavian, Caesar's nephew, and one of the most influential rulers in history in terms of shaping aspects of the future. In other words, Caesar's assassination more or less had the opposite effect as was intended. But for Shakespeare, it was great source material for his based on a true story play, as with so many films today, not tending to bother too much with accuracy. Now for some bonus facts. Speaking of the Ides of March, Shakespeare, and assassinations, the three brothers, John Wilkes, Junius Brutus Jr., and Edwin Booth, all critically acclaimed actors of their day, only once all three appeared in the same play together. That was in a portrayal of Julius Caesar in 1864, with John Wilkes playing Mark Antony, Junius taking the role of Cassius, and Edwin playing Brutus. The funds from that performance were donated to erect a statue of William Shakespeare in Central Park, just south of the promenade, and the statue is still there to this very day. What makes the story of the Booth brothers even more interesting is that it turns out Edwin Booth once saved Abraham Lincoln's son's life, as recounted by Robert Todd Lincoln himself in a letter to the editor of Century magazine, Richard Gilder, in 1909. The exact date of the event is unknown, but it apparently took place sometime around late 1863 to early 1865 at the Jersey City Railroad station, shortly before the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. Robert Lincoln recounted the tale as follows. The incident occurred while a group of passengers were late at night purchasing their sleeping car places from the conductor, who stood on the station platform at the entrance of the car. The platform was about the height of the car floor, and there was, of course, a narrow space between the platform and the car body. There was some crowding, and I happened to be pressed by it against the car body while waiting my turn. In this situation, the train began to move, and by the motion, I was twisted off my feet and had dropped somewhat with my feet downward into the open space, and was personally helpless when my coat collar was vigorously seized and I was quickly pulled up and out to a secure footing on the platform. Upon turning to thank my rescuer, I saw it was Edwin Booth, whose face was of course well known to me, and I expressed my gratitude to him and in doing so called him by name. Edwin Booth was a strong supporter of Lincoln and a Unionist, something which had put a wedge in he and his brother's relationship. In fact, when Edwin informed his brother he had voted for Lincoln during his second presidential run, Wilkes Booth supposedly became rabid and asserted his belief that Lincoln would soon set himself up as a king of America, the favorite trope of a surprising number of people even today whenever the person in power isn't #their leader. As for Edwin, he apparently remained ignorant of whose life he had saved until a few months later when he received a letter from Colonel Adam Bedeau, a friend of Booth's who Robert Lincoln had recounted the tale to. Both Robert Lincoln and Bedeau were members of General Ulysses S. Grant's staff at the time. After the assassination, Edwin Booth saw his famed family name ruined. He lost his brother, lost his president, whom he had staunchly supported, and nearly lost his career due to his association with his brother, all in one day, and with none of it due to anything that he had done. It was reported by his friends that he was brought stricken to the ground, and only with time and the aid of his friends taking turns keeping a close watch on him in the coming months did he begin to make a recovery. He eventually made a successful return to the stage in January of 1866, about 8 months after the assassination. It was acknowledged that the knowledge that Edwin had saved the president's eldest son's life gave him some comfort going forward with his life. Interestingly enough, this particular Booth brother saving the life of Lincoln's son came potentially close to thwarting the assassination. You see, Robert Lincoln was invited to the theater the night his father was shot, but turned down the invitation and reportedly went to visit his friend, the president's private secretary, John Hay. This is something Robert Lincoln would regret for the rest of his life, owing to the fact that had he accepted the invitation, he would have been sitting in the back seat next to the door at the theater, being the youngest member of the party, and thus John Wilkes Booth would have had to get past him to get to Abraham Lincoln. Robert would have seen the gun in Booth's hands, and between those two facts, he may well have been able to thwart the assassination. Of course, it might not have as well, resulting in Robert having to witness the assassination. This would have been noteworthy for him, as he was later present and a witness at the assassination of US President Garfield in 1881, at the time serving as the Secretary of War. Further, he was present when President McKinley was shot in 1901. Because of the fact that he was either present or close to 3 presidential shootings, Robert Lincoln eventually began turning down all invitations, with one exception to be in the presence of any presidential figure, once stating, "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not ask me, because there is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I'm present." The one exception was at the dedication to the Lincoln Memorial in 1922, where President Harding was present, as well as former President Taft. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe for brand new videos every day of the week. Also, please do check out our podcast. It's called The BrainFood Show. If you search BrainFood, one word, wherever you get your podcasts, you will find that show. And as always, thank you for watching.